Hello! So now that you understand a little bit about what climate change is and the evidence that shows us what has happened in the past, what is happening in the present, and what may happen in the future, what we're going to be focusing on today is exactly what those consequences are and why it matters to understand what global warming and climate change are all about. So first I want to focus on what is happening already. So some changes that we are witnessing today, not the hypothetical, maybe one day could happen kind of scenarios that tend to be more easily drawn into debate. These are things that are actually happening. So one of the first things I want you to know is that polar sea ice is melting. The way that we establish an understanding of the trends is by looking at the same time consistently from year to year. And the Arctic sea ice reaches its minimum each September, which is to say that as the ice will grow and shrink during different times of the year where it's warmer and cooler in the Arctic, when we look at just the minimum and compare that year to year to year, we see that Arctic sea ice is actually in a decline and has been for several decades now, but at a rate of about 13% per decade, which is a significant amount. We also see that glaciers are melting. The difference between sea ice and glaciers is where the ice forms. So sea ice, pretty much what it sounds like, it's ice that forms at the surface of the ocean. Glaciers form on land. So when they melt, the water runs off of the land into the water, depending on how close they are to a shoreline. This image here of Mount Kilimanjaro is significantly farther away from the coastline than, say, a glacier in the eastern side of Greenland, for example. But what I wanted to point out is that glaciers are not just in the Arctic, or Antarctic for that matter. They're not just at the poles. Like I said, this is Mount Kilimanjaro, and in this particular region, you can see in the pictures here, the area covered in ice on the left versus the area covered in ice on the right is significantly different. From 1993 to 2000, we've seen almost all of the ice on Mount Kilimanjaro completely vanish, which is really problematic because when that ice melts, it itself is a source of water for ecosystems to the south and for people as well. And so if there's less ice available, less will be melting during the warmer months, providing less liquid water further downstream, which is going to definitely alter habitats, but also make it more challenging for people to get fresh water. We find this all over the place. Mount Kilimanjaro in Africa is not the only example. My example here for you, again, not the only example, but in Montana, in Glacier National Park, named so because of all the glaciers in it, back in the 1800s, 1850 to be exact, there were 150 distinctly named glaciers. In 2015, it's down to 25. Pretty significant difference. Something else to consider is that permafrost is melting. Permafrost is permanently frozen soil. So it is the earth, the water that would precipitate down onto the ground, in this case probably in the form of snow or sleet, is going to eventually infiltrate and work its way down into the soil, but in areas of the world that are so cold year-round, there's very little liquid water, and so most of the water that is in the earth is actually frozen. It's little ice crystals. We call that permafrost. The tundra, everything basically from like the middle of Canada to the north, is almost entirely exactly that kind of characteristic. And what is happening is that as the planet is warming, those ice crystals are beginning to melt, and so you see dramatic changes in the landscape where sinkholes form, the earth actually collapses, because as you know, when water freezes, it expands. So when water melts, we see a decrease in the volume of that, and it's going to cause everything else that is above it to collapse down with it as a result of that change in its volume. We also notice that when permafrost melts, it's going to release any air bubbles that might be trapped within that water, which is going to be a combination of oxygen, carbon dioxide, and in many cases methane, which is a really super potent greenhouse gas. It by itself can actually trap more heat than carbon dioxide, which is a big concern because there's a lot of methane trapped in permafrost all over the world. So as the permafrost melts, it's going to release this greenhouse gas. Greenhouse gases contribute to more warming, melting more permafrost. We get caught in this cycle, which we call a positive feedback loop, where that initial change of the warming temperature leads to basically more change in temperature in the same direction. So that's a problem. Here's an image showing you some of the changes in the permafrost, just to qualify that a little bit more. So the picture on the top right, a neutral carbon balance is basically saying that the amount of carbon taken in by plants is equivalent to the amount of carbon that's released from decomposition and respiration. In the middle image, where we start to see a bit more of that permafrost starting to thaw, the plants are going to grow faster because they have more liquid water available to them and because presumably the air temperature around them is going to be a bit warmer. But that also speeds up a little bit more of the decomposition that's going to occur. The bacteria and microbes within the soil are going to be doing more activities just like the plants are. So even though we might be pulling in more carbon dioxide from plants, we're going to be releasing a bit more from the microbes in the soil and from the process of decay. And then the picture on the bottom is when the permafrost continues to melt and we get even more liquid water. We still have plants growing faster, but the rate at which the decomposition increases is actually considerably more than the rate at which photosynthesis changes. So the end result here is that more carbon dioxide and methane gets released than gets pulled in by the plants. Here's an interesting link to an article. Feel free to read it if you wish, but I just wanted to point out some real-life scenarios here, some current things that we are finding with relation to permafrost melting. It's not just a problem where the Earth might collapse in general regions or sinkholes form or methane being released into the atmosphere, but things that were frozen in the soil for a very long time are thawing out and being released back out into the environment where they can cause real harm. The example here that you might want to read about in this news article is about anthrax. Anthrax is a highly, highly dangerous disease that is caused by a fungus, which gets into the respiratory system and basically kills you by destroying your respiratory tissue. It can affect human beings, but it can also affect animals. And in particular, and in this story, there is a story of a scenario in which, I don't know if I'd call it ancient, but anthrax that had been in the permafrost for years was actually released as a result of the thawing permafrost from the warming temperatures, and it made some caribou very, very sick to the point where many of them actually died as a result of it. So we've seen that anthrax trapped in permafrost has actually accounted for the loss of many caribou herds in northern Siberia. So moving on to another example, we are seeing that sea levels are rising. And in the video that we watched, Bill Nye's Global Meltdown, they focused on Miami and how the city planners and city managers in Miami understand that because of its low elevation, they're going to need to completely change where the street is and where these homes and foundations are to account for the changing sea level as it is going to continue to rise. Now, one common misconception about sea level rise is that it's the result of melting glaciers or melting sea ice. And while there may be some truth to that, in that large ice sheets on land, large glaciers, as they melt and run into the sea, yes, they are going to contribute to sea level rising. Sea ice melting really is not going to significantly change the sea level, but one of the bigger reasons why we have sea level rise is actually just due to thermal expansion. And we saw this too in the Bill Nye video, Global Meltdown, where he puts water in a flask and then he places it in the microwave for a couple seconds, heats it up, takes it out, and you see the change in where he marked the before versus the after. Water molecules themselves will spread out the warmer the temperature gets of that water. So thermal expansion, which is what we call that, is actually leading to significant sea level rise, particularly in the area of the Earth that is from about 30 degrees south to 30 degrees north, or even a bit broader than that, maybe 45. So a huge area around the north and south of the equator. To explain the hyperlink there, if you want to check it out, you're more than welcome to. But there's a hyperlink there to an article that focuses on specific areas that are threatened by sea level rise. Hang on, my mouse is not working. Here we go. Another difference that we are seeing today is that plant and animal behavior is changing. And this is kind of it's an interesting observation from an ecologist point of view, if you're interested in plants and animals and the way they behave and stuff about life in general, you might find that plant and animal behavior can be actually a significant indicator of what's going on with the climate. For example, just to give you a couple pointed examples here, when the earth warms up, the places where plants and animals live are going to change. If you live in the equator and it gets too hot, you're going to move a little to the north or a little to the south, if you have the ability to do so. If you can't physically get up and move, then where you distribute your seeds and where those seeds are actually able to germinate and grow, that too is going to change. So even plants will see, they will migrate essentially to different places. But it's not just about physically moving to another location. The behavior itself of animals is directly tied into things like seasons of the year. And not just as a result of how many hours of daylight there are, but the temperatures in those seasons. In Australia, for example, warmer winters are forcing mountain pygmy possums out of hibernation earlier than usual. And in fact, when they come out of a hibernation, their prey, the bogong moth, which is usually coming out right around the same time, they're mismatching. They're not coming out together. And so it's warmer, the Australian pygmy possum comes out of hibernation, it's ready to feed, there's no food there. They haven't made it there yet, and so many are starving to death. Another example in Europe is of the roe deer. The roe deer's fertility is triggered by the length of the days, not temperature. So they give birth at the same time pretty consistently every single year, but it has in the past coincided with the first big bloom of the special flower that they eat. And the flower that they consume actually helps the mothers to establish their milk so that they can feed their offspring. Basically, what's happening now is the fertility has not changed because it's based on hours of daylight, not temperature, but the blooming of the flowers has changed because of temperature. They react more to temperature than to hours of daylight. So the flowers are blooming earlier because it's getting warmer earlier. Flowers bloom, flowers die. Then we have new mothers of roe deer, and they're ready to consume these flowers so they can bring in their milk and feed their young, and the flowers have already bloomed and are already dead. And so this mismatch of about a month has actually been a reason for the decline in the population because they're not able to nourish their young, so they're having fewer offspring, and the offspring that they do have are having a hard time surviving. So that movement of animals and plants, which I was alluding to earlier, that's really what this slide is about. But anyway, plants and animals are migrating closer to the poles. They're not going to the pole, but they are moving in that general direction, either further north, in some cases further south, depending on where they started. And basically this is a specific relation to global warming, to climate change, because we are able to see more vegetation growing where there used to be permafrost. You could argue that's not necessarily a bad thing, since it means that there might be more plant life in places where there was less in the past, but it is definitely a sign of change. And change is generally not seen as a good thing in a world that has been very consistent for long periods of time, at least not quick change. Those are seen more as disturbances, which tend to put pressure on plants and animals to survive. So as the world warms up and things start to move to the north, we're also going to find that disease vectors, things like mosquitoes, ticks, organisms that carry parasites, organisms that carry viruses that can cause illness in people, where they were limited to areas that were warm, now they're spreading out geographically because there are fewer days of the year where we get hard freezes, which kill off a lot of those animals and prevent their populations from growing too quickly. If you don't get many of those cold days, then the populations can remain established and they can spread, and so can the disease. So that's a concern. We see that native habitats are being faced with this onslaught of new species coming in that are migrating further from their places of origin. And that's creating a lot more competition and a lot more concern relating to invasive species and how it's kind of throwing off the natural order of native ecosystems. Fish are moving to the north, so fisheries are changing. Where we find food is becoming a little bit different. Where food webs are located and the kinds of connections that are so important to maintain the health of an ecosystem, we're just seeing big changes. I mean, I can't emphasize that enough. There's a lot more than just the earth is a little warmer than it used to be. So with all of those big changes already happening, what can we predict for the future? So we see basically it's going to get worse. Not that surprising and pretty depressing, but one thing in particular is that as the planet gets warmer, we're going to have more of those really super hot days called heat waves. In 2015, thousands of people died in India as a result of just soaring temperatures. And every year since then, hundreds more have died every summer because it's just so hot. The people that are most vulnerable to this are the very young and the very old and the sick. And so we're putting a huge pressure on very vulnerable segments of our population simply by having more days that are very hot. Now, one thing to consider, the warmer the air gets, the more moisture it can actually hold before it rains. So in areas that are already hot and already prone to having droughts, you're seeing them get hotter and drier. And that is really putting significant pressure on already scarce resources. So drinking water is going to be depleted. Crops are going to typically have a lower yield because you're not necessarily able to irrigate them with as much water as you typically would. And also the heat itself can be damaging to plants in just the same way that it can be damaging to people. Now, the only maybe silver lining in this is that as we get an increase of heat waves, we are also getting, on the other side, a decrease in cold spells. So it is possible that in the future, fewer people are going to die from freezing to death, and we might not have as many problems relating to crop loss from hard freezes. So maybe take the good with the bad. I don't know. Precipitation patterns are really going to become incredibly different than they are today. Global warming, again, it's not just the Earth is warmer and everything's a tropical paradise. If only it were that simple. When the temperature changes, everything about climate changes. Climate is the average rainfall and the average temperature over very long periods of time. When evaporation rates increase because it's hotter, that's going to lead to more precipitation in those areas where evaporation takes place. So if you're surrounded by large bodies of water, if you are a nation that is very close to a coastline or maybe an island nation, it's possible that you're going to see increases in floods and major storms. But if you're further inland, where evaporation rates are going to increase, but they're sucking up the few remaining bits of moisture that are on the land or on the surface waters, lakes, etc., you might actually see that there's less precipitation there. So when I say precipitation patterns become unpredictable, it's really meaning that it'll get rainier in some places and drier in some places, and not always in predictable patterns, which makes it very difficult to plan for every sort of day-to-day operation, but especially with agriculture and growing food for the world's people. Oops. So I mentioned this a moment ago, but storm intensity is also predicted to change as a result of climate change. We have already seen an increase in the intensity of storms. Fun experiment. Go to Google, type in record-breaking storm, enter, and just scroll through the results. We've seen record-breaking storms every single year for the past decade, where it's a 1 in 100-year flood. Oh, but it happened 5 years ago too. For the last several years now, we've had Category 5 hurricanes that are so far beyond the scale that we're considering maybe adding a Category 6 now, because we're just seeing these intense storms that we really only saw every now and then in the past. They're becoming more common. And so that's expected to continue into the future in a changing world. Ocean currents, I don't want to get into too much, only because it would take a lot more to go back and explain the actual chemistry of the ocean and density and everything else. But basically what you're looking at in this map is warm water from the equator flows to the north, brings warmth, brings nutrients to places like Europe, North America, Greenland, Iceland, and then it sinks because of the cold water and comes back down to the equator. So it establishes basically this like assembly line where nutrients and heat and even animals can be distributed throughout all of the world's oceans. That's a good thing, and that's the status quo. That's how it has been working for as long as we know. Concern is that when more ice melts in the Arctic, particularly if we actually saw a complete absence of ice in the Arctic, which time frame aside, certainly could be a possibility in the future. Essentially, as the ice melts and as the water temperature itself is going to change in the Arctic, that could actually disrupt the movement of water from place to place and might even prevent warm water in the equator that has nutrients being able to be brought to different places in the world. There are some models that predict that Europe might actually be colder as the result of disruptions to the ocean currents. So not as well established, and the models for this show many different things, but in general, it is thought that the patterns of the ocean themselves could change as a result of global climate change. So the last thing, human migration, the rise of diseases. Essentially, people living near the coasts that are going to be affected by sea level rise are going to have to move somewhere. And if you look at the breakdown of where people live, most people in the world actually live fairly close to a coastline. I think it's within 300 miles or so, which you could argue how close that is. But like in Florida, we're kind of all 300 miles from the coast. But I would certainly say that there's enough people that are living in these places where it's a concern. And if you're rich enough to be able to move, great, but what about the people that can't afford to relocate? Whose problem does that become? Is it the responsibility of that particular place's government? Is it the responsibility of the taxpayers? Is it the collective responsibility of all of us, since we all have a part to play in climate change? There are real no easy answers to that politically, and for all practical purposes, we don't really have a plan in place other than small regional areas like Miami, where you saw they're desperately trying to kind of build up a bit. But at some point, you're going to have to get out of the way, or you're just going to not have a home anymore, right? You'll be living in the ocean. We also are going to see changes in where diseases are located. So how is that going to affect human beings? Are we going to be more susceptible to different types of disease outbreaks? Are we going to need to look more at vaccines for diseases that we haven't seen in years but might see more prevalence of due to their thawing or reestablished patterns in different places in the world? One sort of cool story here is of a 30,000-year-old virus that they found locked in permafrost in Siberia. 30,000 years old. There's one virus, 30,000 years old. And it was frozen, but they thought, I wonder if we warm it up a bit, is it possible that we could reanimate it so that it starts to replicate itself again? And they did, which is sort of a crazy story in itself. But the point is, this 30,000-year-old virus that was trapped in ice, 30,000 years, was able to be reanimated and actually attacked an amoeba and was able to replicate itself. The broader picture here is if there are viruses, if there are bacteria, if there are these pathogens, potential pathogens that have been trapped in ice, in a melting world, in a thawing world, what potential dangers might that give us if we are possibly inundated with all of these new diseases? Definitely some food for thought, a little bit creepy and terrifying. In this case, it's fine because that particular virus only kills amoebas, no human cells. But I think it does paint a broader concern of there might be some new things that we find that become problems for us in the future. So that's a look at everything relating to what's currently happening and future trends, and kind of wraps up everything about climate change. Hopefully you learned some things and feel inspired to make a difference. Thank you for watching.